Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever virtual tech summit. So you're currently in the CARES Act session. We're excited to have you all here today. So we're going to wait a few moments just for everyone to join, and then we'll get started. We'll give everyone a couple of minutes. Hi, everyone. Just want to let everyone know you are in the CARES Act session. We're going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join. If you just joined now, we're just excited to have you all here today. So just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to get in. I know everyone's starting to come in right now, but yeah, excited to have you. Hi, everyone. If you're just joining now, welcome to the first ever virtual tech summit. You're currently in the CARES Act session as facilitated by Susan Gentz, partner at K20 Connect. I'm going to give it another 2 minutes before we get started. Just want to wait and make sure that everyone didn't get a chance to join, still has some time. Thank you. Okay, so just to start it off, I think we had a couple of other people just get in, so we'll start it off. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first ever virtual tech summit. You're currently in the CARES Act session. We're super excited to have you here today. My name is Esra El-Shafi. I am an academic strategist here at Tech. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me. Yeah, so I'm Ezra Shafi. I'm an academic strategist here at Tech, and you're in the CARES Act session, which is going to be facilitated by our presenter today, Susan Gentz, who's a partner of K20 Connect. So before we get started, just want to share a couple of pieces of housekeeping. You can actually ask questions in the Q&A box below. So you'll see the tab that says Q&A. We'll try our best to answer some of those during the session. We'll keep checking the chat box and write back to you if we can. And then anything we can't get answered or during that time while Susan is presenting, we can get to those questions at the end of the session. Also, feel free to use the discussion tab to keep the conversation going, comment, communicate with one another, present any ideas or anything that's going on with you currently. So I want to formally introduce Susan Gentz, who is, again, the partner of K20 Connect. Susan comes from a strong policy background as a former staffer in the United States Senate and legislative aide in the Iowa House of Representatives. So along with experience at both federal and state levels, she actually served as the Deputy Executive Director for the Center for Digital Education. She also worked for a government relations firm in Arlington, Virginia, and heavily worked on federal and state education policy at INACOL. I don't know if I said the acronym right, but yes. So where she wrote published reports to move the field forward with innovative learning models, best practices, and policy recommendations. So I'm actually going to pass it to you, Susan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ezra. I am going to get my PowerPoint up for you all. Real quick here. Oh, I always click that wrong one. Oh goodness. How do I move that? There we go. There's what I'm looking for. Okay. Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here today. As always, there is a ton going on in Washington, D.C., so it's always good to have this conversation, even weekly, where we are right now with stimulus funds. So we're going to talk a lot about the CARES Act and still things that are happening in that realm. And we're also going to talk about what could be happening coming up here with another stimulus package. Nothing for certain, so it's a lot of just talking about what we know, but it's still good to understand what might be coming down the pike as you're doing some of your planning. So here's me, I'm Susan Gentz. Thank you, Ezra, for that great introduction. And we're gonna jump right in. So the CARES Act was passed, as you all know, right when the coronavirus kind of really started shutting things down in the states. And this really prompted the federal government to act and to pass a federal stimulus bill as all of the sudden districts had to go fully online. You can see some districts are going to fare better than others based on kind of how innovative they were before the virus hit. There were some districts kind of doing a full blended learning model already where they had a mix of some online and some in person. That made their transition much easier, where you had some districts that were still fully in person, not really embracing any of the new technologies, who that transition then became very difficult and also very costly. So when the CARES Act passed, you can see there's 4 specific areas for education funding for K-12 especially. And so we have the ESSER fund, which allocated, let me back up. So all of this is called the Education Stabilization Fund. So that's all in one area, but then it's broken down into these other funding streams. So $13.5 billion for the ESSER fund. This fund is kind of just like a flexible large block grant. There's no real, you have to use this money for, or you have to use a certain percentage for it. It's really wide open for what districts consider to be the heaviest burden as they transition kind of to that online learning environment. So we have the $13.5 billion that was sent out to the states, and I believe most districts have received their funds. Otherwise, it's still at the state level. But most districts probably know what they have, or at least are going to get from their state education agency at this point. There's $3 billion for the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, or the GEAR Fund. Most of this I've done some research across states. We've kind of seen where this has gone. I'm in Iowa, and my governor put out our $26.2 million is going for connecting broadband. But you can really check and see what governors are doing with that funding at this point already. And then there are some higher education funds in there as well. A lot of that going to student payments and helping the university students with that. One thing I do want to mention that's interesting about the CARES Act funds is they are actually available until September 30th of 2022. There's been some confusion in the field that you need to use the CARES Act right away when you receive them. That's actually not true. There are some funds that districts already have that need to be used prior will expire before these funds will. We'll talk a little bit more about that with some of the waivers as well. So those are some of the CARES Act things. We also have things called microgrants that are available to us. These are brand new and they almost act like a voucher. So essentially what happens is those are a competitive grant where the Education Stabilization Fund is strictly formula based on your Title I funds. So all you really had to do or have to do is make sure that that application gets to the SEA in order to receive those funds. These microgrants, on the other hand, are competitive. And the evaluation criteria for this is that you had to be hard hit by the coronavirus. So if a state like New York applies for it, they're probably going to get some of the microgrants, as we know how hard, or even, Washington with Seattle. So again, I don't know for sure who's getting those grants or who's even applying for those grants, but 40% of the evaluation criteria is to be hardest hit by the coronavirus. And those can be then given down to districts to give directly to parents and families or teachers. So parents and families, you could give them those microgrants. They could get broadband to their home. And then if the funds are available, then they could go directly to teachers, and teachers could then use them for professional development opportunities and things like that. So those microgrants are new. We're still kind of learning a little bit about how they work and how they function, but there is $3 million there for that. So states are beginning to apply for those competitive grants. And then there's also an opportunity, another $3 million with the student-centered funding, weighted funding pilot. And this allows districts to do some sort of innovations with how they actually get their student funding. And this was authorized under the Every Student Succeeds Act, actually, but no money was ever allocated toward it. And the money was then allocated after coronavirus hit as a way to, again, help districts figure out that burden and figure out how to make those funding models work when they go online. And then besides the direct education funds, there's so many opportunities within the CARES Act to partner with states and localities. So for instance, you can see the Institute of Museum and Library Services, they had $50 million authorized to expand digital network access and purchase the devices. And this would be especially, again, for students that come from a low income background. A lot of the SNAP benefits and the poverty levels would indicate how much of that could actually be given for connecting students, which, as you'll see, is one of the highest issues right now, is even just getting students connected. I've talked with a couple of other educational consultants that I know, and they actually do surveys. And one survey went out at the beginning of the year asking parents if they had connectivity and they were able to, have that at home and the broadband that they need. And many people said yes. But then they realized once there were 2 parents working from home and 3 kids on the broadband, they actually didn't have the capacity that they needed to do that. So even though we thought that everyone was connected, it's a different story when everyone's working off the same broadband. So this is another way districts could partner with their libraries. They could partner. Local governments are getting a lot of money for broadband expansion. And again, broadband is not the only issue, obviously, that we need to deal with when we move to a remote setting, but you can't even get past that stage without making sure everyone has the bandwidth that they need in order to make sure that they can participate in their education. So just one example there. Now, the CARES Act was super interesting in how funds were applied for. And everything was super simple and streamlined. So I always give the example of, in the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have Title IV Part A, which is what I call technology dollars. And really, to get those funds, there were quite a few hoops that you had to jump through in order to make sure that you were giving the proper assurances to your SEA. CARES Act was very different. There was a lot of the use of the word may. So in a lot of federal policy, you see the word required. This is required. the CARES Act used, the district may provide X information, the district may do X. So it was a lot more, the goal was to get the funds to districts quickly versus making sure you had a whole strategic plan around everything, which obviously there's, good and bad sides to both of those. So the idea was hopefully that districts were still definitely evaluating their highest needs and how they were going to get solutions for those needs. But also the idea was to make sure that it wasn't held up by the federal government to getting those funds. And in fact, once the federal government received a state application, they were required to obligate those funds within 3 days. So it was a very, very fast moving process, and something that we certainly don't see or say often about federal government with anything going fast. Along with the funds in the CARES Act, we've seen a lot of waivers. We've seen districts start to take advantage of these waivers. And this goes kind of back to why I said that date was so important to know when the CARES Act needed to be used by, because actually districts have a lot of money that they're able to use that they wouldn't normally get to, because there's usually a limitation on Title I Part A of carryover funds to 15%. That's waived. So districts are able to keep whatever they hadn't spent out of Title I Part A. And for some districts, that's a good chunk of their budget. A lot of them save it for professional development in the summer. And so I just urge, if you're helping districts or if you are a district, think about how you can use those funds at the very minimum in conjunction with the CARES Act funds, but I would say try to get those used up first, because you only have a year to use those and they go back to your SEA if you don't use them. So I would say to make sure that you're thinking about those funds and then thinking about the CARES fund, or as I said, at the very minimum, at least thinking about how you use them together to get more bang for your buck, get some more bundling done, whatever that looks like and whatever your needs are. So that's a really important waiver that has a lot to do with funding. And then we have some other ones. The second one up here is that, you can keep all of the other funds that you have from these other titles. Not a lot of people have very much of that left by the end of the year, but it's still there on the table anyway. We also have a lot of waivers around Title IV, which I already mentioned, and the technology dollars. So before, if a district received $30,000 or more from Title IV Part A, they were required to do a needs assessment to make sure, again, that those funds are being used effectively. That's waived. You can use all of those funds on whatever you need. None of that funding needs to go to that needs assessment or the time for that matter. And then we also have requirements in Title IV Part A about 30% must be spent on a well-rounded education, 30% must be spent on safe and healthy schools. And then there's this technology piece where there was a cap at 15% on technology. All of those are gone. However you need to use your Title IV-A funds, that is now allowed. So that's another important one that really helps with that transition to needing technology to facilitate new learning environments. And then finally, we have a waiver from the definition of professional development. And this would allow districts to now, if you have a new product and you need to pay for some consulting on it or whatever that looks like, you're able to do that quickly. There's not as many, again, assurances requirements on that. This is, again, using that carryover. So just looking at those strategies, I hope that you understand how important that is to make sure that you don't lose out on funds. But very useful, flexible waiver from USDE to really help make sure that we have the most funds available to us during this time. So this is an interesting survey that Whiteboard Advisors did in conjunction with the National Association of Federal Education Program Administrators. And they had 195 responses on here. And this is really interesting because it's important to see that right now, approximately 50% either for sure don't know or they're uncertain how they're going to use these funds. And this was done now probably about a month ago, so it's getting a little bit dated, but it was a really interesting survey to see that district leaders are still trying to figure out what the use of their ESSER funds are. And then I thought the interesting part too was how they discuss how your district plans are using these funds. And you can see hardware, the internet capacity, online devices is still the #1 issue for districts, what they're trying to solve and spending money on. And then we have the instructional software, and then cleaning and health, which I think that one will probably go up as more people go in person. That's going to be a really high priority to make sure that those buildings are actually staying clean and not doing any more for the spread of the virus. And then you can see things go down a little more, but then staff professional development is still pretty high. What's interesting to me on this graph too is the backfill or making up for cuts in state aid is on there. So under the Every Student Succeeds Act, we have something called supplement, not supplant. And that means essentially that you cannot use these federal dollars because basically your state cannot cut their budget by the amount of federal dollars that you're getting. The idea is not for federal funds to take the place of your state funds. And so it's really interesting that we have that in ESSA, but it's not required in CARES Act. So there's been a couple of states where you see a state budget for education get cut by the exact amount that they're receiving from the CARES Act. Under normal federal policy, this would not be an option, but it is something that can be done. We're seeing so many estimates of how short states are falling in their budget. So some of them are choosing to cut their budget based on the federal funds that they're getting. So if there's more questions about that, we can talk about it. But under normal circumstances, that would not be an allowable use. However, under the CARES Act, it is permitted. And that is the main gist of what's already happened. And what I want to talk about a little more is really what's coming, because I think a lot of people on here are probably pretty familiar with the CARES Act already, or maybe if you're a district, you've received your dollars, or if you are helping districts, you kind of know what that lay of the land looks like. And what's really interesting is what's coming. So when I first started talking about the CARES Act, Senator McConnell, who is the lead in the Senate, he kind of said and hinted that in order for districts for education to receive more money, he wanted to see what they did with this first round of funding, which is totally fair. And I think what's really starting to show is that really it's not even getting to education yet. It's still getting the students connected, making sure they have devices, that kind of priorities for districts right now. So what's really interesting is that he's already proposing that we have another stimulus round, and he's proposed right now $105 billion for education. So under the CARES Act, education got $58 billion for K-12. And so that's what it is so far, right? And now he's proposing $105 billion, but he has not specified whether or not that would be solely K-12 or if that would also, again, be split between K-12 and higher education. And also what's really interesting, and there's a little bit of tension happening too, is you may have seen remarks from USDE or the Trump administration on incentivizing schools to go back fully in person. And Senator McConnell didn't really lay out if there would be conditions put on that funding, if it's you're only getting it if you're in person or not. So this is something to really keep your eye on and see what happens if there are conditions, or if it's again going to every district across the country, just something to keep an eye out for. And then, we saw the HEROES Act in the House. And I think that's pretty much dead on arrival in the Senate. But it was really interesting to see what they proposed from there, which was $175 billion in educational stabilization funds. So the 105 out of the Senate is actually quite surprising, because it's somewhere in the same ballpark. It's certainly still less, but there is this opportunity that districts will get another round to help cover some of these costs that happened so quickly and without any warning, really. And then the other interesting bill that's been introduced is called the Coronavirus Child Care and Education Relief Act. And this is again from the House. It's the Schumer bill. He introduced it. And he's also putting the $175 billion in that fund. So most bills that start in the House are likely right now, because of party control, not to make it into law. But there are, the fact that the Senate has even really started seriously discussing indicates that there will be a second round. Where if you would have asked me that 3 weeks ago, I would have said, I'm not sure if there will be a second round or not. It's looking more and more like there will be. And the idea was that they would get all of this done prior to their August recess, where nobody is in DC for a month. They're back campaigning. They're honestly, after living there for 5 years, it's a swamp and miserable and so hot, and so nobody is there. But they were hoping to get things done before that August recess. It doesn't look like that will happen, which will then make things even more interesting for the election in November as they go back in September. So there's obviously so many moving parts and a lot to take in, and I certainly didn't cover it all, but I would like to leave some time for questions while we're in this session, or if there's any further information that I can share too. And I think I saw...
Yeah, we actually have one question here from Kengo Yamada. Thank you for asking. They're asking, wait, so you are saying that the CARES Act support to states could be conditional on whether or not districts reopen schools fully?
The future one, yes. So the CARES Act, everyone got that. But Patty Murray, who is the ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, where the education funding would go through, has said that that condition of physically reopening schools in order to get funds is a non-starter for Democrats. And really, I don't think that the Senate is looking to start, especially the Senate's vulnerable right now. And so, you know, they're only a few seats away from being the minority. So I think everyone is being super careful in what they want to do. But it's also what the Trump administration is pushing, and everyone working together. So it's certainly being discussed. I think it's unlikely that that condition would be put on the table. I think purely for optics, if nothing else, would be a bad idea. But yeah, if you can even Google it and see some articles about it, or I could send you some links if you'd like, because it's certainly unprecedented to see something like that placed on the distribution of those funds. It's a crazy time.
And we have one other question here I could share with you.
Great.
From Audra Squire. The Tarrant County Health Department has said schools must be online until September 28th. How will that affect the new CARES Act funds?
That's the CARES Act funds that have already been distributed should be totally fine if you're online already, but it would be for anything going forward. So you may choose, maybe your state or your city or your county has said, we're not going in person, we're going online. The funds that you already have are yours. They're not going to be taken back from you, but anything going forward could be withheld if that happens. So please, just because we're talking about speculation here, that's not what's been decided. I honestly think it's unlikely from all my experience. I think it's some good media articles to write and get out there and get everyone all riled up, as you know, we like to see happen with clickbait headlines sometimes. But yeah, if that's what would happen, is if you've already been mandated or told that you are going fully online, the funds you have are yours. Anything going forward, if that happened, would be withheld. Which again, I think is very unlikely to actually happen.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I don't know if we have any other questions in the chat box. If anyone had to wanted to ask Susan anything else. But I did share your contact, Susan, in the chat box as well. So if anyone had any other questions, they could definitely reach out to you directly. I know I did that when you did your first session. It was super informative.
Yeah, well, and there's a few other things that I could talk about that aren't necessarily, again, education, but could be helpful if that's okay with everyone.
Awesome.
There's some new provisions in the CARES Act for telehealth too, which can impact a lot of students. So if there are students with physical or behavioral health needs, and they typically rely on intricate or a patched together network of medical or other service providers, in normal circumstances, there are financial and regulatory challenges to obtain federal approval for a state to provide some of these services. But in the wake of COVID-19, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services have allowed doctors to bill for telehealth appointments, which before they were not allowed to bill for them. So there wasn't a lot of incentive for doctors to offer those types of services, where now they can bill for those. And we're seeing a huge increase of telehealth. And this is especially important for students with learning disabilities or behavioral health issues. Another change in CARES Act that can really help some students that need some of those additional services, to make sure that they're getting those. So even in like IEP meetings, you can have, your occupational therapist in the Zoom, because they can actually still bill that for their appointment or whatever that looks like. So even though, again, not directly education, still a way to consider helping students through some of these flexibilities. There's nothing that was actually allocated funding wise for it, but again, those flexibilities are huge. So that's one way that we could do that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that is, again, not specifically CARES Act, is there are a couple of federal programs to really help families make sure that they're connected. And one that I'm not hearing many people talk about is the Lifeline program. And this was modernized back in 2012, and it used to be, so not politically correct, but many people referred to it as the Obama phone program, if you've heard of that, where families with on low income could receive a cell phone. And that program was modernized to include connectivity. And so families who qualify for that program can get internet access for $9.95 a month through some subsidies through the Federal Communications Commission. So if there's families that are struggling to be connected, you can use that program as a resource. And also the E-rate program, there's a lot of advocacy work for E-rate right now going on to get something like $2 billion more funded for that, to make sure that districts and libraries are connected. And all of that funding comes from that universal service charge that you see on your telephone bill that goes to that program to help connect schools and libraries. So again, not specific CARES Act, but other federal funding places that could help families or districts as they are working to make sure that their students are connected. I mean, even if a district's doing hybrid at this point, you still have to make sure if they're going 2 days, you've got to make sure that they're still connected at home. And even if you're going fully in person now, who knows what the fall and winter will look like. So maybe you'll be going fully online again. It just, completely depends on where you are, but still helpful resources. So those were two other ones that I wanted to mention.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was excellent and so informative. Always learn so much from you.
Yes. Well, please reach out if there's any other questions. I know policy is a lot to take in. I try to make it as fun as I can so that we can talk about all of the things going on. And of course, underneath the federal level of what's happening is the state level, which is seeing huge hits, districts putting hiring freezes, all sorts of things that are happening while states are trying to figure out creative ways to fund what that could possibly look like. So if you're a district and have questions, I'd love to help you. If you are someone working with districts, helping them, reach out to me. I'd love to help you. It takes all of us to really make sure that we use these dollars effectively and that we keep showing the Senate that we deserve more funds in the future to keep making this transition.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge. As always, thank you.
Sure.
And thank you everyone for joining today. I'm actually going to post in the chat box our virtual tech summit event that we have. Today's the last day of our virtual tech summit, but we do have 3 more sessions before the end of today around some elementary STEM, safe and efficient deployment of student devices, as well as facilitating hybrid classrooms and remote learning. So feel free to join, and as always, feel free to reach out. And I know a question early on was about sharing the deck, so definitely wrap around to Susan and we can share that information with everyone that attended today. Oh, awesome. Thanks so much, Susan. And thank you for taking the time. Awesome.
Yes, thank you for having me. And again, please let me know if there's anything else or any other questions.
Thanks. Have a great day, everyone.